In the previous video, I commented on the first half of a conversation that Cliffe and his son Stuart had with two university students in America. Now, in the first video, I tackled the question of who is God? A person, as Cliffe claimed, or energy, as the student claimed. Today, I want to tackle the second half of the conversation as Stuart steps up and discusses the Hindu doctrine of karma, caste, and proselytization in general. Now, I had concluded my previous video by praising Cliffe's directness and truth-seeking, but at the same time, I did say that I don't like his methods and his conclusions for obvious reasons. While Stuart has many of the same strengths and weaknesses his father does, so let's focus on him this time. I really like the second half of this video, honestly, and there is a ton of stuff to get into, and I'm concerned that this video is going to end up being way too long, so let's just get straight to it.
So from a Hindu perspective, see, I think you should be out here. Maybe not with the same kind of voice as him because you guys are slightly hardwired differently. But I do think sometimes you should maybe be on this corner.
That's a great point. Thank you for talking out here. I appreciate it a lot, okay?
But I do think, because I have some Hindu friends and I've been to their homes and I've had conversations with two different women who said to me, we're in different caste systems and so one is slightly more valuable than the other. And it was a very awkward conversation. But I think for you to love me would be to come out here and say, hey, Stuart, you have a slightly bad sense of karma because you've been living a certain way. I want to help you, not come back as a cockroach. So I'm going to help you and communicate what a good type of lifestyle is according to the Hindu faith, rather than just saying, don't push your faith on somebody because that's considered proselytizing. Well, by claiming not to push your faith on somebody, that's also a form of proselytizing. Maybe it's a form of quieter proselytizing, but see, this sweet woman right here, I am very impressed by her, and yet the same thing that she was doing, she was basically calling him intolerant for the way he was communicating an exclusive truth. She was communicating an even more intolerant exclusive truth because she was saying she had this kind of 30,000 view of all religions and that they are either the same or that they should not be communicating their truth in a certain way, when 87% of the world is making exclusive truth claims about their own religions. So what's more exclusive and intolerant?
My thing is okay, so you guys are out here preaching, spreading the word. I get the.
Hopefully not preaching too much.
Okay, no, but
I want to be PC.
Okay, but spreading the word. Okay, we'll say that. But the thing is, Hinduism is a very accepting religion. Obviously, you have to be born into Hinduism, but you can still practice it as a religion. But okay, I'm speaking from my experience, how I grew up. Nobody goes around
I agree.
no one spreads the word like that. If someone is interested and want to come, the arms are always open, but no one avidly goes out and spends their time doing that.
Why not?
No, but I'm asking why
Help me.
you guys?
Why aren't you doing that though? If my karma is bad and I'm headed towards being a cockroach or something worse than a cockroach, why wouldn't you come and talk to me?
But the thing
Help me out of it. Help me out of my ignorance.
I just don't understand.
I've had Hindus come up to me and offer different paths than the ones that I'm communicating.
Yeah, that's fine. But it's. I just don't.
So you disagree with the style of communication?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and there are things I don't like on both sides. You see, Stuart's dig at the caste system from out of nowhere was noted, and I will address it later on in the video because he goes further down the road a little later. So the main topic of this segment is proselytizing, which is defined as literally the action of attempting to convert someone from one religion, belief, or opinion to another. Stuart begins by saying he thinks the Hindu student should be doing what he and his father are doing. If she loves the people, she should be up there telling everyone about their bad karma and directing them towards a better lifestyle according to the Hindu faith. Why? In order to make sure that Stuart doesn't end up reincarnating as a cockroach or worse. As he said, help me out of my ignorance. Now, by the end of the clip, the student says that what she disagrees with is actually their style. And in that sense, I agree with her. She doesn't disagree that they preach, but the style with which they do it. You see, Hindus are called to share their faith, but under quite specific instructions. In the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, verse 67, Krishna says, "This teaching should never be revealed to one who is devoid of self-discipline and devotion, nor to one who has no desire to listen, and certainly not to one who is envious of me." In the very next verse, he says the following: "But the one who gives this highest mystery to my devotees displays the highest devotion to me, and shall come to me. There is no doubt about this." And to conclude, in the very next verse, so chapter 18, verse 69, Krishna says, "There is nobody who can perform a service more pleasing to me than this, nor shall there be another on earth dearer to me than he." If we now jump back to chapter 3, verse 20, Krishna says, "Indeed, you should act bearing in mind the welfare of the world, loka sangraham." In the very same chapter, he says, "Shakta karmani avidvamsho yata kurvanti bharata kuryad vidvamsh tata shaktas chikirshu loka sangraham." Again, this idea of loka sangraham, the welfare of the world. Arjuna, just as the ignorant act with attachment to their work, so should the wise act without any attachment, thinking only for the welfare of the world. In verse 26 of the very same chapter, Krishna says, "The wise should not disturb the minds of the ignorant who are attached to work. Instead, by performing work with devotion, one should inspire others to do likewise." You see, these verses from chapters 18 and 3 of the Bhagavad Gita are why the student intuitively disagrees with the style of Cliffe and Stuart's work, and I do too. I fully understand why they do it, but what the Gita teaches us is that sharing one's faith or truly caring for the welfare of others can and should take on many forms, and speech is not always the appropriate one. Krishna teaches us not to disturb the minds of the ignorant, but rather to inspire them by our loving example. The Bhagavad Gita teaches us not to impart sacred knowledge onto people who are not interested in it or who are hostile to God. In fact, I believe the Bible teaches us something very similar in Matthew 7:6. "Do not give that which is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, for they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Now, you may ask, how do we know who the right people to preach to are in that case? How do we know if they're ready, if they're pigs, dogs, etc.? The answer is simple. They will come to you so long as you're willing to be found. If you're doing your task of actively trying to inspire people by your example, and not your words, then by way of their own volition, their own attraction, they will ask you why you are the way you are. How, what? They will ask everything. And then you have the invitation to share what you have. And there is no greater service than the one who does that. And nobody dearer to God. So honestly, that whole exchange about preaching was great. But what I didn't like from the student was that despite saying that Hinduism is a very accepting religion and that anyone can practice it, she also said that you have to be born a Hindu. Now, she didn't make this up. There are plenty of Hindus who think this way, and for pretty obvious reasons, I completely reject it. And I find it to be a really problematic stance to take. First of all, what does it even mean to be born a Hindu? Does it mean to be born in India? Are we talking about modern-day India? Pre-partition 1947 India? If it doesn't mean being born in India, as that student might actually not be, does it then mean to have Indian ethnicity? In that case, would I be qualified if I was born in Pakistan to Muslim parents who clearly share the same Southeast Asian ethnicity? Is it enough if I am born to Hindu parents? Perhaps Hindu parents who perform Hindu birth rituals on me as a baby? Or perhaps we need all of those things to happen simultaneously. You see, as you can tell, it's a ridiculous situation. Not least for the religion that has Sanatana Dharma as its actual name, which literally means the eternal duty or path, I assume, for everyone. You see, its foundational principles like the Atma, a soul, samsara, reincarnation, karma, dharma, moksha, and more are true for everyone, whether you choose to believe them or not. It's not that only Hindus have Atmas, or only Hindus have a dharma to fulfill or karma to burn. As I said, I think this is honestly a ridiculous idea that has no grounding in the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, and it should absolutely be shot down whenever it is brought up. It's a shame the student chose to bring it up, even if she did, in a sense, caveat that statement by saying how open and accepting Hinduism is. Anyway, let's move on to the next clip.
Now, my last piece, well, no. I'm not going to go. All right.
No, what is?
It was a question on Hinduism.
Good, ask her.
Sure, I might.
Well, this is a little bit tougher, a little more direct. So, as also a therapist, I'm also a mental health therapist. I'll go to the bedside of a person dying. And when I am there, oftentimes I'm thinking about worldviews. Typically, it's my own worldview, it's my own faith, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about a suffering God, Jesus Christ, who is with us in our suffering. He's the only suffering God that I know of. Then I am thinking about something like atheism. If I am an atheist going to the bedside of my dying mother or close friend, see you later. Sorry, you're falling through a trapdoor into just timeless, spaceless eternity. Take care. Depressing versus an eternal existence, falling through a trapdoor into the loving arms of a God, a personal God, is radically different. Now, my Hindu friends, though, I also believe have a little bit of a problem when it comes to an understanding of suffering. Because it's the one-to-one correlation of, if my mom drives into a car accident today and dies, there's a one-to-one correlation of her doing something wrong that caused her suffering and death. That's radically different from the Christian faith, which is not just the suffering God, but it's also, there is death, there is confusion, there is all kinds of pain and suffering that typically has nothing to do with your bad deeds or bad karma.
Okay, yeah. Ours is based on karma.
Right. But do you see how that's problematic? Like, that does not fit my experience. When I'm dealing with death and dying folks, to go to them and say, sorry, you have cancer because you did something wrong, whether it was last week, yesterday, or the day before.
But the thing is, like, it's not that minuscule. It's like what you've done throughout your life. So you know how, like, in Jai's book, okay, I'm a sinner, like, I've sinned. It's not like, oh, like, I tripped someone yesterday, so now I'm going to go die in a car crash. It's like the accumulation of all the bad deeds that we've done.
Okay.
So that can lead up to, like, one moment, like, okay, okay, you died in a car crash forever. But obviously when that person is dying, you're not going to be like, oh, like, you caused, like, in a way, like, you cause your own, because everyone has to die, okay? That is, like, obviously the end game. But it's not like, it's like everyone has to die, but when you're on your deathbed, no one's gonna be like, oh, like, you caused your own death. This is why, like, it happens for a reason. Like, everything happens for a reason. That is the underlying belief.
Oh, yeah. And I can get on board with that.
Yeah.
But I can't get on board with your bad deeds are just accumulated, so you're gonna die a worse kind of death than the person over here, like this sweet little lady who was saying that she's just living for goodness. So she's not going to suffer, as opposed to the person perhaps who grew up an addict because maybe their parents were addicts, and so they had a type of bad deeds when it came to their alcoholism. So somehow they're going to suffer worse because they're worse people, and let's ostracize them. Versus this sweet lady who's supposedly living for greatness.
I mean, not necessarily, because you say that, like, your parents are addicts, so you're an addict, and, like, you're, like, doing drugs and everything. That can be understandable because of the origin that you come from, like, your parents. But the thing that's going to cause your karma is the actions you take being that person. It's not necessarily what you start from. Do you know what I mean? Like, every person is responsible for their own action. Just because, like, you may have a tougher background, like, that's obviously taken into consideration. Like, I don't know. But what I grew up knowing is that it's your personal action that caused, like, your, like, course for the rest of your life. Like, obviously, if you do something good, like, something good will happen to you. Or, like, you're making your own life better. But if you do something bad, then that's going to catch up.
Right. Okay. And I can probably get on board with that. Sure. Sin follows us in many ways.
Yeah. So it's not from, like, just because it's not like you've written a bad fate. You know what I mean? Like, you can always turn it around. Does that make sense?
Right. And yet, at the same time, there is a big difference between grace and forgiveness in the Christian faith versus in the Hindu faith. You still are determined by your bad deeds. It's a type of determinism.
I mean, yeah.
Whether it's accumulation of me when I was in high school and I was living a very partying type lifestyle versus perhaps more so now, I don't know, maybe I am better ethically.
I mean, that's true, like, but in a sense, like, it's also, like, just like you guys repent, like, you can go to the temple, like, you can pray, like, there are certain religious rituals that you can do that better your karma, but don't erase it.
Okay.
So it's not like just because you do this, it's in your, like, permanent record forever, like, it's etched forever, so now you're gonna die. Like, it's not like that.
I'm very confused by this section for a number of reasons. Let's get to them. He talks about how, as a mental health therapist, he is often at the bedside of dying people, and he highlights Jesus as a suffering God. But then he claims he is with us in our suffering. So wait, Is his point that Jesus is relatable because he suffered? Because he was tortured and crucified? That is supposed to comfort a sick, dying person? Well, God suffered, so he must understand my suffering. Even though most likely there is no comparison between what Jesus went through and what the average sick person is going through in the hospital ward. Or is it that an otherwise omniscient and loving God is incapable of empathy or understanding? Honestly, I just find it a really, really bizarre point. Now, after death, I totally get it. You fall into the loving arms of God, as Stuart said. There's an afterlife, it's eternal, it's great, sure, no problem. I think, but the problem here is that it's the same is true of most religions, including Hinduism. In contrast to that, I get his depiction of atheism as being unable to offer the person any comfort and instead just adding to their possible depression. No problems there, I agree. He then says that the Hindus have a problem with their way of dealing with suffering. He goes on to basically say that because of the doctrine of karma, where everything that happens to us has a one-to-one equatability with our karma, he would have to go to a dying person and say, I'm sorry, you have cancer because you've done something wrong. Suggesting that somehow this is not a very nice thing to do, or that it isn't comforting. He does go on to say that it doesn't match his perception of reality. So I assume that he means that he doesn't see that those cancer patients have done anything so bad that would merit that type of outcome in their lives. But honestly, it just leaves me more confused. Since when are we the judges of a person's conduct? Since when do we see all things internally and externally that a person does? Not to mention the fact that karma accumulates over thousands of lifetimes, so it might not even have anything to do with this life. Now, the student's response isn't philosophical, but I find it pretty great nonetheless. She points out the super obvious fact that no mental health therapist would go to the bedside of a dying Hindu cancer patient and remind them that the reason that they have cancer is because of all the previous bad deeds they committed. Nobody would do that. But the underlying issue for me is, if you're not comfortable making the person accountable for what's happening to them, as is the law of karma, then what is your alternative? The person got cancer randomly? Or was it by God's will? Surely that's not a very comforting idea. You see, earlier Stuart already said that in Christianity, a person's sickness, suffering, pain, or death rarely has anything to do with their bad deeds. So there seems to be no causality there. And in the very next segment, the student says that in Hinduism, everything happens for a reason, and rightly so, I agree. But Stuart goes on to say, I can get on board with that. Wait a minute, what? So the cancer happened for a reason, so it can no longer be random. He's already said that it isn't the fault of the patient, so what's left? God willed it? But it gets worse. Stuart says what he can't get on board with is that someone who has performed worse deeds suffers a worse outcome than someone who has not performed those bad deeds. What? I am so confused by this. So their conduct should bear no consequence to their outcomes? What happened to accountability or justice? He then goes on to attack a straw man by pointing out that someone might be an addict and therefore accumulate bad karma because of the parents that they had, because they too were addicts, essentially suggesting that a person might get dealt a bad hand, essentially just have bad luck. But you see, that doesn't work in Hinduism because of the simple marriage of karma and reincarnation. You are never dealt an unlucky hand with your birth. You are born in the circumstances your karma dictate, exactly as you have constructed it. Anything that goes on to happen to you is a direct consequence of your previous choices. He then suggests that that person will be ostracized on account of their bad deeds. Ostracized? By who? Certainly not by God, the only being that truly matters in this equation. Krishna says in chapter 9, verse 30 of the Bhagavad Gita, if even the most sinful person worships me exclusively with devotion, he must be regarded as a saint, for he has rightly resolved. Now you see, this verse completely confirms the student's response, that in Hinduism you can turn your life around regardless of your karma. Stuart then retorts by saying there's a big difference between the Christian faith's idea of grace and forgiveness and Hinduism, where you are essentially determined by your bad deeds. Honestly, he could not be more wrong. And it's not the first time I've caught a Christian apologist making this claim. Once again, I'm going to let the Bhagavad Gita speak for itself. Now, I already cited the previous verse showing how even the greatest sinner is immediately regarded as a saint if he but turns to Krishna. Is that not forgiveness? Let's add a couple more to the mix. Those people who have faith, who are free from envy and always practice this teaching of mine, will be released from karma. So says Krishna in chapter 3, verse 31. Abandoning all dharmas, surrender to me alone. I will take care of your sins. I will liberate you. Have no fear. Chapter 18, verse 66. He says, I will take care of all your sins. Is that not forgiveness? I will liberate you. Is that not grace? Now that we've touched on grace, let's hear some verses that talk about grace in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, focusing your mind on me, by my grace, you shall overcome all obstacles. If, however, out of pride you do not listen to me, you will be ruined. Chapter 18, verse 58. O Arjuna, surrender to him alone with your whole being. By his grace, you shall obtain supreme peace and the eternal abode. Chapter 18, verse 62. Krishna is saying, by whose grace will one attain the supreme abode? God's grace. I honestly just don't understand why this idea that Hinduism is devoid of grace or devoid of forgiveness or of a loving relationship with a personal God is so widespread among Christian apologists. It's as if their educators read a book on Advaita Vedanta or some form of atheistic Sankhya perhaps, and decided that that was Hinduism and ignored the most widespread scripture of them all, the Bhagavad Gita. It's just very strange to me. I could be quoting tons of scriptures to refute these points, but I'm sticking to just one, the most famous one, the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, let's address the final clip of this conversation.
Why did I have that very awkward encounter with those two women, who one was higher up than the other? The Christian faith we were talking about out here yesterday, which is everybody, it doesn't matter if you have a lower level of awareness or cognitive abilities, which I'm probably lower than you, and or you're born with special needs, whatever the issue might be, we are all created in the image of God, absolutely equal. We do not have to somehow prove our self-worth, prove and get my value by any kind of means necessary. Instead, no matter what, our value doesn't change because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. In my understanding in Hinduism, that's not the case. You are born into a type of caste system where you are better than somebody else who was born into a different caste system.
Yeah, well, like, to be honest, like, I don't believe in a caste system, so, like, I see.
Okay. In the Christian faith, your bad deeds can follow you if you just keep living in sin, making poor decisions, but you're never too late to turn and accept Christ, just like the thief on the cross, and Christ turns to him and says, today you will be with me in paradise, because it's based off of grace versus I got to do all of this white knuckle it on my own and somehow I'll get to heaven.
Okay, so let's work our way backwards here. I already addressed the final point. According to the Bhagavad Gita, it is never too late to turn to Krishna, and by his grace and help, we can always attain his eternal abode. We do not have to white-knuckle it on our own, as Stuart seems to suggest. The idea that in Christianity you have help, but in Hinduism you don't, is nonsense. Now about the caste system. There are multiple mistakes here, but not all of them are Stuart's fault. I have to be fair. The caste system, or the four varnas as they are actually termed, are not meant to be a hierarchical system in the eyes of God. They are divisions of labor, divisions of society, as required for a fully functioning society. Unfortunately, that is not how many Hindus view it, nor implement it. So the very idea that one of the two ladies that Stuart spoke to was higher up than the other is a mistake. His statement about the equality of all humans in the eyes of the Christian God also holds true for Hinduism. Once again, I will return to the Bhagavad Gita to prove my point. Krishna says in chapter 4, verse 13, I created the 4 varnas based on their work and gunas or qualities. So Krishna is the creator of this caste system, the 4 varnas, God himself, based on their work and qualities. So as the creator of this caste system, surely his word on the matter is of greatest importance, even more so than the entire population of practicing Hindus. In chapter 5, verse 18, Krishna says, the sages perceive with equal vision a good and learned brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, or even a dog-eater. Krishna goes on to say, I am the same to all beings. There is no one hated by me, nor is there anyone I am partial to. But those who worship me with devotion live in me and I in them. Chapter 9, verse 29. A couple of verses later, he says, by surrendering to me, whatever their birth, race, sex, or caste, even those whom society scorns will attain the supreme state. Now, is it true that in cultural Hinduism, certain religious positions and activities are forbidden for certain castes? Yes, it is true, undoubtedly. But the same is true in most Christian denominations. In Catholicism and Orthodoxy, women are not permitted to be priests, bishops, they cannot become popes, patriarchs, they cannot lead the church, they cannot conduct the liturgy, and the list goes on. Now, I know that there are theological justifications for all of this, but my point remains the same, that around 50% of the world's population is barred from certain activities on account of something they cannot change. To suggest that Hinduism has some kind of unique problem because of this poorly implemented caste system is a really gross misrepresentation of the world's religious landscape, in my opinion. And with that, I wrap up this 2-part analysis of Cliffe and Stuart's conversation with the university students. Now, I had said in both videos that I'm not a fan of their methodology, and of course, I don't agree with their conclusions for obvious reasons. I want to summarize why it is that their methodology is problematic. You see, instead of fighting on the basis of truth, instead of trying to discover the truth behind certain claims, it often seemed, especially in the case of Stuart, that it was a question of how comforting is this idea versus that one? How attractive is this idea versus that one? Let me bring up the caste system because it is something that I can easily criticize. Not that it's something that I'm challenging whether it is true or not, whether it has some benefit or not. The same thing was true of almost every other point that they brought up. It wasn't so much an exercise in truth-finding, although Cliffe did more of that in the first video, and more of a comparison, competition, a gentlemanly fight, I would say. And I think that's the issue with most debates that we find these days. I think debates can be healthy. I think debates can be incredibly productive if they are truth-seeking exercises where two people have intellectual respect for each other and they're genuinely open to have their ideas be challenged. But what often happens is two people who will never change their position are throwing jabs at each other, sparring with each other, often not to convince each other, but the audience that's watching. And so it's about trying to get the other one, catch the other one out, use a more compelling argument, use tools of debate to try to win the point rather than arrive at the truth. If Cliffe and Stuart would ever be open to having one of those sincere, honest, truth-seeking conversations with me, I would love to have one with them about Hinduism, about Christianity. And I believe that there's a lot that we can see eye to eye on in that discussion, even though, of course, there will be differences of opinion. I hope one day it can happen. And in the meanwhile, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Jai Gurudev.